Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. Now we are finally covering the coup in Bolivia. We've talked about it in several episodes about struggles against neoliberalism, but because my show only airs once a week, I didn't want to air anything definitive until things had somewhat, I don't want to say stabilized again, but we know better what the situation is, who essentially was behind the coup in Bolivia, and what the sort of social movements were that brought that to power to some degree. So we're going to be talking about all of this. We are joined by Jovanni Reyes and Todd, both from About Face, which is a veterans organization against U.S. war. Thank you both for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yeah, very glad to have you. I'm wondering if I can start with Jovanni, if you can just bring us kind of up to date with how initially this coup unfolded, how it essentially turned from violent street protests, or at least, that was the way it was phrased, was street protests, but kind of violent insurrection, how the different right-wing factors of the police and military wound up siding with these different right-wing civilian groups. And yeah, if you can just kind of bring us up to speed as to like where the Bolivian government stands today.
Well, this whole thing started prior October 20th, where that's when the election election results was coming out, was unfolding. From the beginning, there was already known they were going to refuse to accept any results from the election was coming out, because they already knew that they were going to lose the opposition. When I say they, and there's multiple factions of the opposition, but the opposition already knew they were going to lose. Because the popularity of Evo Morales for the last 14 years has been the most stable government that Bolivia has had. Prior to Evo Morales, government in Bolivia have went from scandal to scandal. Presidents have resigned after resigned, including the vice president, the candidate. The candidate that was running against Morales was the vice president of a previous administration who had to resign because of a scandal with a certain group, a massacre, right, that happened against certain environmentalist protesters, right? So all that unfolded, and he was running again. This guy named Carlos Mesa, he was actually the favorite from Washington. He was the one that Washington was backing, including the right-wing senator in Florida, Rubio, was also pushing messages to back him up and everything. But from the get-go, they were already planting the seeds of insurrection, planting the seeds of not recognizing the results of the election, putting doubts on people that the election was going to be fair in the first place. So when the results started coming in, and what they would keep counting the quick count, and then they paused the quick count, they had Morales ahead before the quick count pause. And then when the results started coming in from the countryside, from the more rural side, right, they had a jump in Morales' electoral voters. For Morales, right? And had 10% of a lead over his rival Carlos Mesa, which would avoid for him to go on a second round of election. That's what it was used to provoke the street clashes of people that were actually waiting for it to come out. People from the Santa Clara,
Santa Cruz,
yeah.
From the Santa Cruz sectors already, which is a stronghold of the opposition, which are already waiting for an opening. They're waiting for a spark. They're waiting for something to happen so they can go out, to give an excuse to go out They started terrorizing the Evo supporters. Some of these people, either them personally or people that were associated, probably the rioters, they kidnapped a mayor from a nearby town, a female named mayor. They cut all her hair off, and they doused her with red paint, and they made her walk down the street barefooted while they were mocking her, with videos and everything. They burned houses down. They burned government buildings down. So all that riot was going on while the election was coming on, while the election results was coming on. The police already refused to go out, and police chief refused to send out the police to calm the situation. So it just pretty much gave more fire, more momentum to the coup. And then when the General Kaliman came on TV demanding the resignation of Evo Morales, Evo Morales did. He resigned. He resigned because there were people from his party that were being threatened. There were people from his party whose families were being kidnapped or they were being held against their will, threatened. And in his speech, he says that Morales said that he resigned because he wanted to avoid bloodshed in the street. And that's what he did. And then he was removed. As soon as he was removed, people from the right-wing paramilitaries that were out there, led by this character named Fernando Camacho, they entered the presidential palace, presidential office with the Bible in hand, and pretty much claiming the presidential palace for Christ. Next thing you know, this other woman, Janine Áñez, was being given the presidential slash, and she comes from the party that was actually was a 4% actually on the polls, because her party was also running for president, and they were getting 4% of the vote. Evo had I think was 47%, and her party was 4%. So that's something inexplicable. How was she became president if she wasn't even in the lead? If her party wasn't even in the lead? She comes from pretty much I forgot the name of her party, but it's a evangelical, right-wing evangelical party, base party. So that's how everything went down. Next thing you know, Evo was they were looking for Evo out in the street. They were demanding his arrest. Next thing you know, that Mexico was able to extract Evo out of Bolivia. Meanwhile, neighboring country was refusing airspace for Mexico, Brazil, Ecuador to fly in their airspace with Evo. So the Mexican government had to reach out to the Argentine new incoming government, not the one that was current at the time, but the Macri government, but the new coming in government, which was that of Fernando Kirchner. And through them, they were able to get secure airspace to leave Bolivia and fly into Mexico.
Yeah, but I will be honest, I am surprised that Evo Morales made it out alive in this. It very much seemed like they were going to assassinate him, that this was going to be a Pinochet-style coup. I mean, with the amount of bloodshed that was in the street that was caused by the right-wing protesters, the police, and later factions of the military, it very much seemed that Morales himself may not make it out alive, or that he may be indefinitely imprisoned. But he was able to make it to Mexico. He then took trips to Cuba, and it appears that now, as of our recording this on December 17th, it appears that Morales' current plan is to apply for asylum in Argentina. That was the latest I heard. I'd like to kind of clarify a few things when we're talking about some of the Bolivian politics here. We see a lot of similarities in the way these coups unfold between the sort of official front of the right-wing opposition that supposedly represents the kind of civil society, and the actual kind of violence, the muscle behind the coup. So in this case, we see the similarities between Bolivia and Venezuela with much different outcomes. For instance, the civil society, the quote unquote moderate Republican in Venezuela was Enrique Falcon. He was supposed to be the one that represented kind of the moderate forces. I don't think there's such thing as a moderate right winger, but that was what was presented. And then behind him, of course, there was Juan Guaido, who was involved in essentially fascist coup attempts, very, very far right wing parties, the Popular Will Party and whatnot. So we see that sort of bait and switch where it's if this kind of widely not really well liked, but also not that explosive candidate doesn't win, then we will essentially unleash the coup. We, being the United States and the right-wing force within the country, will unleash the coup and overthrow the government and bring this other literal fascist force to power. And so the same thing happened with essentially Carlos Mesa, who was a disgraced former president who's already been forced out to resign. That was the front around which the right wing had united at the point of the election. He was supposed to be the opposition candidate, the officially sanctioned opposition candidate. But then you see after the coup, who is it who's brought to power? Well, it's not even Carlos Mesa. It's Camacho, as we're talking about. Who's
Jenny Añez.
What's that? Jenny Añez, yeah. Camacho was the one who went into the palace, said Pachamama is no longer here. This is now a Christian country, essentially a slap in the face to indigenous peoples of Bolivia.
In the early days of the coup, it was widely understood that Camacho and the civic committee, and the historical oligarchs that his family is a part of and sort of represents, had a lot of organic ties to Añez and her coterie at the time. I think due to sort of heroic blockades and the reaction of the populace, a lot of the power was shifted away, and there has been sort of a distancing, but it was very obvious that that Camacho was sort of part of the. I mean, when she took power and she was elected before an almost empty Senate after the Mas had either strategically fled, boycotted, or were physically prevented from entering the National Assembly. When she was, following that, when she announced, on the awning, he was with her at that point. So it was. There's a lot of different figures at play, but it's very easy to see the sort of organic connections and the reestablishment of a historically privileged sector of criollo and oligarchic powers.
Yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit about the nature of Bolivian society as well, which has typically been very divided between those who count their European descent, who are primarily based in Santa Cruz, versus much of the more mountainous indigenous peoples who tend to be in the more rural areas, as well as La Paz, but who tend to be very kind of pro-socialist and pro-Morales and whatnot. And who tend to be just obviously an oppressed class. I mean, there's still that settler colonial mentality amongst people within Bolivia, even if that settler colonial power base was to some degree interrupted by the Morales years. But I also want to, when we're talking about the kind of legal justification, a quote unquote legal justification for this coup, it wasn't even case made that Morales wasn't going to win the election. The case was made that Morales didn't win by at least 10%, which could have prevented essentially the runoff election. There's no question at all that he won the election. It's did he win by 10%? And the other part of that, the accusation that Morales somehow tampered with the vote, is also obscene, absurd, because the area that was essentially waiting for the votes to be tallied, the area that took the longest, that was that the right-wing opposition was accusing Morales of having tampered with, was from the mountainous areas, which is Morales' base of support, which is the areas that it takes the longest to receive the vote tally from, because it's so rural and so isolated. But the idea that those indigenous peoples in the mountainous areas, the Morales base was somehow going to suddenly vote for again, disgraced former President Carlos Mesa and throw the vote for him, it just falls flat on its face. And so the OAS at the time of this coup put out a very vague public statement accusing the Morales administration of vote tampering, vote fraud, but they have still to this day offered no evidence whatsoever, as opposed to many organizations that have looked at this, have audited the elections, such as the Center for Economic Policy Research, and said essentially that they could not find any evidence of vote tampering. That seating of Janine Áñez in a nearly empty Senate after essentially all of the senators, all of the line of succession had either strategically stepped down or had been forced out by the kidnappings of their family, by the fact that, like, many of the senators' homes were burned, their families were threatened, etc. The fact that Janine Áñez couldn't even find enough people to essentially provide her coronation, and that this is being called a quote unquote caretaker government, really speaks volumes, I think, to the fact that they're not even trying for legitimacy. I've also seen some reports from the Gray Zone, which is an amazing investigative journalist source, that is essentially showing that there are major splinters within the right-wing opposition that's may lead to a complete fracturing of the opposition, similar to we've seen the fracturing of the right-wing opposition in Venezuela post-coup attempt there. It seems that now that the deed is done, they no longer have that kind of social cohesion to even be able to put together a single presidential candidate. They may wind up splitting their own vote, depending on, again, of course, the military and the police are playing a huge force in trying to repress the MAS, the movement for socialism.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you put a couple points there about in comparison with Venezuela and Bolivia, and you're right, and about the split between the right wing factions, the conservative faction, even liberal factions that join the right wing. And you're right, they don't have any national project, and that goes in Bolivia, that goes for Venezuela, that goes for Ecuador, that goes for Chile, they don't really have a national project. Their national project, the conservatives of these countries, is to give the resource away. That's the national project. Give the resource away to multinationals. That's, if you see it, there's the first thing that happened in Ecuador when Moreno came to power. The first thing was to dip the country back into IMF, where the previous government under Rafael Correa, paid off the debt from the IMF, right? The first thing this government did was to go back into another debt, right, and give away the resource, right? The first thing that the Áñez government is doing right now in Bolivia is doing the same thing, right? Giving away the resource, right? Evo Morales, right, nationalized a lot of the resources in Bolivia. Keep in mind, at one time in Bolivia, before Evo Morales, right, they even privatized the water. That's part of the water wars, and that's one of the things that brought Morales into prominence. Morales was an organizer for a syndicate, for a union for cocoa growers, and that's one of the things that brought him into prominent national stage, is because of all these anti-privatization wars, which they were even trying to privatize the sky. When I say they try to privatize the sky, they would try to prohibit people from collecting rainwater, right? So they were, so all these governments, all these conservative governments, all these Washington line governments, all these Washington consensus government, whether they're right wing or liberal, their national project is to give the country away, to give resources away to multinationals, and align themselves with Washington. That's pretty much their core, the core of the spirit. Todd can add some more into that, because he was actually living there when there were another coup attempt back in 2009.
If you're just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOP 91.7 and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are talking with Jovanni Reyes as well as Todd Arena, who are both organizers with About Face. This is a veterans anti-war organization, anti-imperialist organization. We're talking about the right-wing coup in Bolivia. And I'd like to, as Jovanni mentioned, I'd like to turn to Todd now, who was actually in the government, or not in the government, but in the country in Bolivia at the time of an earlier 2008 coup attempt. When we were kind of discussing pre-recording, we were talking about some of the connections between the figures there, and essentially many of the same figures involved in that coup are also currently involved in this coup. So yeah, I'm wondering if you can just go over kind of your story, kind of what brought you into Bolivia and what it is you saw.
Sure. So, and I think it's a good parallel to look at, because you see a lot of the same tendencies and themes at play between the 2007 2008 insurgency from the far right and what just recently happened. What brought me there? So I guess just to put it out there, I think it was I had been sort of politicized by the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq, that as being a service member at the time had sort of shattered my view of the world and opened my eyes to a new reality. And I think that sort of propelled me to sort of look for, well, where are the resistances to this imperialist model that I was an instrument of for a period of time. And Bolivia seemed like a very important example. And I went there to sort of just witness, and I'd gotten tired of reading all this back and forth, people saying, well, it's too complicated, it's not left and right, you're boiling it down to these narratives is inaccurate. And I just wanted to go and see for myself on what the truth was and what was really going on. And I think, of course, reality is complex, and there's always nuances, and you can argue endlessly. That's one of the weaknesses of sort of centrist liberalism. But if you take a step back, you can sort of see the broad strokes. And I think that was one of the things that struck out to me so clearly at the time. I went to Sucre and spent that sort of the another historically elite areas, not quite in the complete lowlands. It's on the way to the lowlands towards Santa Cruz, and it was considered the historic capital of Bolivia. There's sort of a split capital at the time between La Paz and Sucre, where you'd had the Supreme Court and other functions in Sucre, and then the sort of economic, administrative apparatus in La Paz. And that was always a sort of a tension between traditional elites and newer elites under the military regimes, the progressive military regimes of the earlier and mid 20th century. And one of the things that happened, so around that time, the main, there was always this opposition to Evo Morales and the MAS, and particularly the figure of Evo as an indigenous person. The same slogans that we heard being bandied about in the streets were already at play at the time. Evo Asesino, the murderer Evo, as well as just explicit racial epithets. And so, those have sort of always been at play to people sort of opposing the changes that he was sort of presiding over as the representative of. He had been brought to power by a broad-based movement of the formerly dispossessed, and one of the main tasks of his administration early on at that time was to sort of preside over and allow a truly participatory democratic constitutional assembly, like throwing out the old colonial and post-colonial constitutions and coming up with one that fully recognizes the territorial sovereignty of indigenous nations, as well as the citizenship of all members of the society, explicitly those that had been excluded from it to the point of not having the suffrage until sometime in the 80s. And so that was the big threat at the time, rightly so, understood to be, if we let them have this constitution, we as the traditional elites will never have power like we had historically ever again. And so what happened is similar. You can't just come out and say that, at least at that time. Maybe as the far right sort of takes on more explicitly fascistic tendencies in the coming decades, we might see that sort of resurgence. But in the neoliberal era, you had to mask your opposition to those types of changes with liberal discourse. And so rather than saying we oppose indigenous people, writing the Constitution with us as a minority, they were involved, but they weren't privileged in that process. What they had to say was, well, it's all these power plays, Moss is authoritative, and they would use legitimate grievances from further left groups. And they would say, well, we agree with these guys, and that's our banner too. And we're just mad about the same things. And one of the other factors that they used was the Capitalia, which was saying that, well, this constitution is going to take away the historic traditional capital in Sucre and centralize power in La Paz. And so we're just believing, sort of like a states' rights type argument. We just want to stand up for the traditions that this country was founded on. And you sort of mask it in these sorts of, more palatable grievances that sort of, it's just about rights and respecting tradition. But tradition in a colonial system, a settler colonial system, takes on characters of apartheid. And so are those really are those really legitimate rights in a democratic society? And I think that same sort of bait and switch is at play a lot in, there are legitimate grievances from certain many sectors of further left grievances, let's say, to put it simply, with respect to take a group that has taken state power. Obviously, right? There's contradictions that inherently come from that, and in the same way, you see the current movement taking up these grievances while obviously not giving to whatever is about it, because you really think that the far right is going to be the ones to protect Mother Nature. I mean, come on, it's absurd. And so you see them sort of taking up these grievances that are some groups, it's legitimate for them, but they take them up as a way to delegitimize and fit it into a liberal narrative of why they have to do this and why they're an organic sector of the social movement uprising and all this stuff against Morales. And the most painful thing is how many, especially in the international community, have fallen for this and have, it's been used to sort of drive a wedge within sort of anti-imperialist or left, or especially liberal voices in the international community who say, well, he has done a few things that do seem a little icky, and so I bite my knuckles, and I can't really come out and defend him against a blatantly obvious coup, and so I think that's sort of you see a lot of those same patterns. They just happen to work this time in a way that they didn't in 2006. And there's a lot of, probably factors and reasons, but I think one of the big ones is the fact that, there was, a similar problematic, both externally and internally, in terms of the way these narratives of what the grievances are, taking valid ones, magnifying them, and then wrapping it in this narrative of fraud and let's be honest, demonization of the movements themselves. I mean, if you started reading it, I thought I was reading coverage on like Israel and Palestine, which was shocking to me. The sort of importation of the logics and discourse of the international war on terror and a resurgent settler colonialism into a context that it's completely irrelevant to, and how that was taken up by members of the middle class there and here, that really did prevent a sort of an outpouring of defense for the regime against against this insurgent right-wing uprising. And so that's sort of where I come at it from.
That particular logic of settler colonialism is interesting, and I thought also that the comparison to "quote unquote" states' right is also interesting, because there was an attempt by essentially the primarily white, primarily rich sectors in Santa Cruz, to essentially form what would have been like a segregationist, white supremacist society at one point. It was a full-blown secession movement to try and secede from Bolivia. Can you maybe talk about that and who was generally involved in that? I'd like to also get into the specifics of the characters and of the kind of actors within this. One other point I'd like to make real quick is that many of the highest ranking military and police officials who were involved in this coup were trained by the School of the Americas, which is a notorious U.S. regime change operation, I believe based in Georgia. So we see the U.S. fingerprints all over this, for this idea that there was anything, that there was an organic people's uprising that was co-opted by the right wing. No, this started very much with the right wing. This started with the same separatist, far right-wing, white supremacist separatists. And when I call them fascists, I don't use the term fascist to describe just anything. When I use fascist, I'm talking about their videos out there of the movement. I'm forgetting the exact name, but it was a kind of Christian youth movement, Sieg Heiling, in propaganda videos. That was the movement that was that Camacho was a part of. But yeah, let's get into some of the that particular moment of the sort of the separatism, the other kind of coup attempts, and like basically who are these kind of these right wing elites and how they play, how have they sort of continued on to this day?
Yeah, so that the secession attempt was basically their response to the failure to derail the Constitutional Assembly, realizing this is going forward. They basically had risen up. They had whipped up a bunch of students in the university in Sucre. All kinds of crazy, the use of mythology again. Oh, these indigenous are they're rabid, and we have to defend Bolivian traditions, and to the point where somebody, I was not in Sucre at the time, but one of the people told me that who was a university student, that the way it worked out is the professors basically whipped the students up and then closed the school doors and said, go out and riot. That's what led to, and then you had massive sort of, white riots in the streets that forced the Sucre police to retreat from the city. They had to retreat to Potosi. So that was sort of their hope to derail this Constitutional Assembly. It didn't work. I mean, Morales, it sort of went on because Morales probably felt, the MAS probably felt that, they didn't want to send the troops in. They didn't want to come across as sort of repressive. So they sort of said, we're just going to let this process continue and hopefully this will burn itself out. It got to the point where certain groups like the Ponchos Rojos, the Red Ponchos, said, look, if you don't deal with this, we're marching down from the Altiplano with our, old, rifles that we had fought against the military dictatorships earlier on in the 20th century. and will handle this. And so, basically, at that point, the government's hand was forced, and they shut down the protests, and the city was a battle zone for a few days. And they eventually had to move the Constitutional Assembly to I think it was Oruro, another sort of higher up in the highlands, away from Sucre, and that sort of that, and then it proceeded, and a draft of a new constitution was put together that could then be put out to direct ratification from the populace, it's sort of direct participatory democracy exercise, and that sort of diffused the right-wing attempt at that time. So basically, the secession movement was, well, if they want this new sort of social democratic constitution that doesn't give us the privileges that we had come to expect from under colonialism and post-colonialism, then maybe let's just create our own state. And so there was an attempt by not just Santa Cruz, but a couple of the other lowland. It was called the Media Luna because if you look at it on the map, it looks like a crescent. Beni, Pando, Santa Cruz, and Tarija. And the goal, I mean, those are the areas with sort of traditional landed latifundia elites, large, massive landowners, sort of feudal landowning. That's sort of the political economy is like feudalism. And so they're like, well, let's just break off. And so there was a big stalemate around that and a lot of concern. And I think it did end up extracting some concessions from the MAS where they said, look, let's they're talking about autonomy. The indigenous communities are also talking about autonomy. Let's come up with a scheme for a sort of federalism of semi-autonomy within the country that would actually allow us to give some handouts to them while doing it largely to achieve the demands from the various indigenous nations for autonomy. And that sort of was one wing of it. What I heard at the time actually was that they would have still gone through with the secession anyways. I mean, they didn't want semi-autonomy. Obviously, they didn't want to be sort of subordinated in any way to a sort of indigenous led and socialist government. And what I heard, what it was is at that time. You have to keep into account regional politics. So for them to succeed, they would basically need to be either absorbed or at least receive the tacit support of Brazil. But this was Brazil, during the pink wave era, and so Brazil basically balked at the last minute, was the word on the street. And without Brazil being on board, the U.S. government would not lend its support. And that was effectively the end of the far-right secession movement at the time, as they said, look, the U.S., obviously the U.S. supports us in this, that we have all the oil and gas in the lowlands anyways, but without Brazil on board, we can't go forward with it. And obviously none of that is, I haven't seen anything showing that yet, but that was sort of the rumors at the time, and it sort of conforms to a lot of the, makes a lot of sense to me based on what I saw on the ground. And just to the last point about who, I mentioned the latifundia. You also mentioned the explicit fascism. Santa Cruz, sort of the history of Santa Cruz was arid lowlands, going into pre-Amazonian areas, good farming land, good also for other growing activities. My understanding is that it sort of exploded as a population center starting in around the 1950s, fueled by the drug trade. Cocaine is something you can produce with coca leaf, but it's actually it's a highly capital intensive production process. So it's, all this pointing the finger at Evo and the Cocaleros as being these drug kingpins. It's like, they're farmers. You need industrial chemical products in order to produce cocaine. Who do you think were the ones that were the capital owners? That was Santa Cruz, actually. So all these claims of, we need to get the drug trafficker out are sort of too cute by half, and sort of, people talk a lot about how white supremacy is projection. I think you see an example of that there. But also around that time, sort of staying with that prehistory of Santa Cruz, a couple other points that missed in that narrative is, when it was starting out, it was an explicit white project where they had actually invited white South Africans and Rhodesians to come and settle the quote unquote empty lands to help build the kind of society that they wanted to build there. And you see a lot of that same legacy today. Macho Camacho himself comes from these sort of explicit fascist groups. He's part of something that's the civic committees is sort of the Civic Committee of Santa Cruz is like this unelected clandestine, it sort of represents the economic and landed power in Santa Cruz. And they have a youth wing, which is explicitly proto-fascist, if not now explicitly fascist in its symbology and its methodology. When I was there in 2007, 2008, they were one of the main actors in terms of, street violence. There were scenes of, people described scenes straight out of Mad Max of masked people on motorcycles terrorizing campesino and indigenous pro-Constitution Assembly protests. And if you look at the imagery coming out of the most recent crisis, the most recent coup, you see them doing, as you mentioned, they're sort of armed as paramilitary groups. And so even one of the the former members of MOS who had split with Evo over the 14 years of hegemony under his rule, even one of those people described in the immediate wake of the coup, saying that this is an indigenous leader. She said that this is once again a 500-year struggle coming to light. And so I think that is, that is, if you take a few steps back, that has to be seen as the true nature of what we're witnessing now.
For those of you just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We continue to be joined by Todd Arena and Jovanni Reyes, who are both members and organizers with About Face. That's a veteran anti-war organization. We are talking about the right-wing coup in Bolivia. So it seems that much of this, again, according to the Gray Zone, it seems that much of this right wing is fractured in their attempt to consolidate the coup. I mean, it's certainly, for all the trouble the right wing is happening, it's still nonetheless a historic setback for indigenous peoples. The indigenous peoples absolutely connected the struggle of Evo Morales to an anti-colonial struggle against the white supremacist elites that we've been talking about. I don't think I can stress it enough that Americans on the left, Americans who are interested in social and economic justice, need to understand settler colonialism, the logic of it, the capitalist origins of it, to understand what these struggles are. If you don't understand that clearly, if you don't understand these sort of social and economic and property relations within settler colonial societies, the way it's been laid out by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz or Gerald Horne or any of the other anti-colonial writers, for sure, if you don't understand that, then everything else, I think, in a sense, becomes absolute nonsense trying to understand world events. The fact that Bolivia, for instance, as you mentioned, brought in people from Rhodesia, people from apartheid South Africa, and that now that the Bolivian state is bringing in different Israeli consultants in a quote unquote counterterrorism campaign. I mean, all this settler colonial logic is absolutely linked. But getting back to an actual question here, with regard to the right wing fracturing, this also comes at a very particular moment in that whereas most of the other neoliberal governments in place, such as Colombia, Peru, Argentina, Chile, are seeing major protests against them, are actually beginning to show signs of weakness and collapse. This is one where the right wing actually scored a victory, but it does seem to be against the grain. It seems to be sort of against the historical moment for sure.
Tom made a point there about the attempt to secede back in 0809 and Brazil's role, and what you just mentioned there about the whole holistical colonial settlement dynamics that's going on here as well. So when we look at Bolivia, we shouldn't, and the coup just happened, we shouldn't see it from an isolated case. I mean, it's more of a regional project what's going on here. At the time of the troubles in 0809, the majority of the countries that surrounded Bolivia were progressive governments, right? They were part of the pink tide that Todd mentioned earlier, right? Which was governments for the first time in Latin American history where a plethora, multiple countries had progressive governments in power. And they created an organization called UNASUR, right? Which is in opposition to which is the United South. And then they also which is similar to the OAS, but without Canada and United States and just pretty much countries in the South, right? And that was their first test, actually, Bolivia in 0809. That was the first test to handle a regional conflict, which was that. And at the time, Maria Bachelet was in power in Chile. You had Lula in Brazil. You have Krishna. You have Hugo Chavez. So you were pretty much, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, so they were pretty much around. So they didn't really have the support, they didn't have the power to go through with it at the time, right? Fast forward to the day, right, where most of the progressive governments in the region have been rolled back and they've been taken over by corporate or conservative right-wing governments, right? Now this putsch now, right, had a better chance of succeeding than it did back then. So they went with it. They went there because at the time you had Macri in Argentina, which is a neoliberal government, right? You had Bolsonaro in Brazil. You have Moreno in Ecuador. You have in Venezuela. You have Venezuela under siege right now, under siege by vicious U.S. sanctions. So they had all this support group, all the support network, right? This international right-wing network to support them in this and what they just did in October. So they went ahead with this. So we got to look at this from a regional perspective, right? What is the goal here? The goal here is not to personalize what happened, to personalize the event to one person, to Evo Morales. The goal here is to pretty much roll back the whole region, eliminate, stomp out progressive government, stomp out socialism, right? And pretty much have a region that is subordinate to U.S. policies, to U.S. economic interests. That's the goal here, right? And also to the local oligarchs. So you mentioned about this being a success for the right, but at the same time, it's kind of a mixed bag. At the same time, Argentina just lost their neoliberal stooge, right? Now they have Fernando and Christian back in power, right? And they're the one who invited Evo Morales to Argentina. They already made moves already. You have in Mexico, which shares a border with the United States, we have pretty much over about a century of U.S. friendly compliant governments. Right now, it has a government right now under Almo Obrador Lopez, right? Who was the one to offer asylum to Evo Morales under a lot of heat. He came into a lot of pressure by American journalists, by Mexican right conservative journalists or or right wing journalists, right? He came under pressure by lawmakers like Rubio in Florida for doing that, because he came by Eli Abram, right, for allowing Evo Morales to come to giving refuge to Evo Morales, right? And his answer is, Mexico's a sovereign country, and we chose to do this, and we're going to go with this, right? Because that's what they want. They want compliant countries. So we got to look at this from a regional perspective. We can't see it from individual. We can't see it that Maduro's bad or Correa's bad or they're good, or it's a regional project. It's a regional project taking place here. They try and roll back the successes of the progressive governments in the region, and it has a more holistic context to it as well, because we're seeing right now with the United States empire, right? It's an empire in retreat right now. It's an empire that's being pretty much got beaten in Syria, got beaten in Afghanistan, got beaten in Iraq. They're pretty much an empire in retreat. So if they can't control Latin America, right, they can't control anywhere else. So we got to see things from that perspective.
And then just to narrow it, and I agree with everything Jovanni just said, but just to narrow it to the Bolivian example, with respect, I have a hard time seeing the right wing being able to consolidate. I think they've already lost a lot of the center of gravity just through the heroic efforts of social base that maybe did not turn out to defend Evo at the time, but once it became clear what the nature of Áñez's acting government would be, and the repression began, the reprisals against MAS leaders, the lifting of charges that had been sort of dormant for a while to prosecute former MAS administrators. You saw them sort of start pouring out in great numbers, and the MAS itself has sort of started a long process of reconstruction, self-criticism, and reformation in a sense. They just had a large their first assembly conference since the coup 2 weekends back, I believe, or maybe it was just one. Things are moving so quickly these days. A day feels like a year. But and they had a massive outpouring. You even had miners, representatives of miner unions that had split with Evo come and show up and say, if we were incorrect, we apologize, but we're here now. So I think the question is going to be not whether the right wing can consolidate, but how long it's going to take for the social basis to, whether it's through MAS or whether through it's a new platform for the coalition of policy reforms, grievances, and representation. The question is going to be which instrument that is. If it's MAS, then we could see it rearticulate itself as soon as the April elections, and if not, it will be sort of a longer process. And I think that's the sort of story here is this is a temporary win. This was, I think a big part of this is you had 14 years of the most stable, like Jovanni started off with, the most stable period in the entire history of that country, and the highest rates of growth in the region. And so I think to some extent there was maybe a lack of immediacy of the threat of the far right that the far right was able to exploit and surge itself into power. But I don't see the Bolivian people are some of the most militant and disciplined social movements I've had the privilege of encountering in my existence. it is not going to happen. They will not let that happen.
People always talk about the lived experience of oppressed people, but the question to me is, to what end? To just simply point out that oppressed people are oppressed, or to to gather and understand and interpret these experiences, not just of oppressed people individually, but people who organize against their own oppression in the form of political parties, in the form of social movements, to understand what the experiences are as a group fighting against oppression in whatever form that is. That then becomes kind of larger social movement to overturn, to bring about a revolution for a better way of society. So it's to me, so much of that is about sort of taking not just the victories, but also the shortcomings and the losses and the setbacks, and understanding what it is that happened from kind of an objective material level, understanding how what could have been done differently, understanding how things came to be, and sort of preparing for them. So I think those leaders within MAS certainly are learning from this experience. The reason I think that the right wing always so brutally, when it comes to power, so brutally represses workers and indigenous movements, is to prevent that kind of cross-generational, intergenerational knowledge and experience from taking form, so that we learn, so that we are able to learn from our from what came before us. Here in the U.S., we have this problem where essentially the left was crushed so brutally in the 1960s through the FBI's COINTELPRO that we forget all of the lessons learned by the Black Panthers and their sort of building of international solidarity and other social movements of that time, the anti-war movement, the anti-imperial movement. In a certain way, we've even, in the American left, for a long time had forgotten the lessons of the anti-war movement, for instance, against the Contras and against the sort of like right-wing Reagan-era coups. And so we find people trying to relearn that lesson here, while at the same time, those within MAS and those within these kind of Latin American countries that are under U.S. assault are also trying to sort of gain their experiences, collect what it is that's happened, and scientifically say, this is what we need to do to move forward. So we have about 2 minutes left. If you have either of you have any sort of last thoughts on that, on Bolivia, or anything else.
We could learn so much from from South America generally and their historic struggles, but specifically the Bolivian peoples. And I think there does tend to be this sort of we know best attitude that we have here in the U.S. that I think it is sort of completely inverse to the reality. Actually, we have so much to learn from the lessons and the lived experiences as living, breathing, as you said, not just in the abstract, but sort of realizing that these are historic actors making complex and incomplete and contingent decisions at any given time, and making principled stances rather than just sort of bull-siding it sort of from the sidelines with sort of a squishy liberal attitude, but sort of taking up and being willing to take risks and take chances and even make mistakes at times in order to advance the struggle further. And I think that is something that we have so much to learn from them. And just to say one other thing that I heard over and over again, I just fell in love with, as I think you can see, the sort of that Bolivian fighting spirit. But what I heard over and over again while I was trying to find a way to maybe how can I help Bolivia and their struggles, and what I heard over and over again was, if you want to help us, go home and enact change at home, because we can't do anything until you enact change at home. And so the best thing we could do is sort of learn from them on how to enact change here in the U.S.
I think that's a great place to leave it. We are going to go ahead and wrap up there. We were joined by Todd Arena and Jovanni Reyes of the organization About Face, a veteran anti-war, anti-imperialist organization. Thank you both for coming on the show.
Thank you.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.